So good morning. I don't even know what day of the week it is. No, it's Saturday morning. I can't remember the date. What is the date
The 25th.
Saturday, the 25th of April. And we are here again with our legislative constituent roundtable, and Mollie Burke is here. Emily Kornheiser is not able to be here today. She had a conflict, and I am here, Tristan Toleno. And I'm not sure if we'll get our Senator Becca Ballant, who lives in Brattleboro, joined us last week. I'm not sure if she's going to be able to join us this week, but so appreciate you all being here. And what we've done is typically we've just gone through a quick update if there's anything that we have to share about what we've seen legislatively this week, and then open it up for questions. And I'm doing a formal introduction because we have been sharing this with BCTV in order to share the information that we have with the larger community. And I so appreciate all of you having been, and Oscar's cat, awesome, having been willing to allow this conversation to be shared with the larger community. I think we're all familiar with the technology at this point because we're all pretty regular participants in these calls. And coming in is another one of our consistent attendees, Michael. And I just want to say that normally Emily and I share the sort of tech management responsibilities. And I'm going to be doing both of those things today. Both parts of the role of being host and also trying to manage the tech. So if I get strangely paused, that's why. And so we have two folks joining us. And I want to just get us going here, but I'll just say again, good morning, that we are recording so that we can share it with BCTV. And then, I got Mary coming in. Good morning. Yeah, so I'm going to hand it over to Mollie and let Mollie give a little update on our legislative week, and then I'll add on top of that, and then we'll just open it up for our normal questions. If something comes to you while Mollie's talking, just drop it into the chat and I'll go through that list. And Millicent has been taking notes and sharing them with us, and then Emily's been able to use those notes to share back out as well, so to give people another way of capturing the information. So we will, with that, Mollie.
Good morning, everybody. And I'll just talk a little bit about, we had a very historic week because the Vermont legislature, for the first time in the Vermont House, for the first time in history, voted remotely, had a remote session as if we were in the chamber, with bill presentations, with votes, all sorts of things. It was a marathon day. It was about split. We had a morning and an afternoon session, but I think in total we were in session for about 5 hours, something like that, on Zoom, and having to pay attention because there were numerous votes, because we had a lot of procedural motions about moving legislation, being able to take things off the calendar, being able to message our actions to the Senate, etc. And I think most of the bills that we discussed sort of fall under Tristan's purview. I'll just sort of name some of the ones we had. All of these had to do with emergency response to COVID. So that's what's happening. And there are all sorts of implications of, that you wouldn't think about, like, well, the notarization issue. But so this one gave the treasurer the authority to borrow from different restricted funds in case she needs money from one, to cover something else. So currently it's 15 days she's allowed to do that. We extended that to 45 days before and after the end of the fiscal year. Tristan can talk about that in more detail, but I'm just sort of giving an overview just of the kinds of things that we were dealing with. Nothing really controversial. Maybe there were 1 or 2 no votes on some of these things. Background checks for contractors performing work in state buildings, execution of wills, and that's a really important one because a lot of people want to do wills, particularly elderly people in this sort of situation, and don't want to be, right now you have to be in a room with other people, and we allowing that. That was a Senate bill, so that had passed the Senate. So it'll just get signed. There's a bill about labor requesting tax information from the tax department for the Pandemic Unemployment Act, for people getting, self-employed people getting their insurance, and a couple of other things. Some judiciary things related to, because the court hearings are suspended, and there was a controversy about people not doing license suspensions, and DMV had a lot of problems with that. So that bill is, that sort of measure is being shelved to another bill. So that's just sort of an overview of what we did, like just to show you that there were just a lot of housekeeping things. Anyway, and mainly my week, in addition to all these Zoom calls and committee meetings, was dealing with people's uninsurance. Pandemic, the self-employed people are now able to apply for unemployment insurance, and there are just so many glitches, and people are trying to get through. And I was hearing from a lot of constituents. I finally wrote to the Commissioner of Labor yesterday. I was a little bit reluctant to do so because he's just been overwhelmed, but he wrote right back, and I said people were having a really hard time, and some people were pretty agitated. And he said that they were doubling the capacity on the lines yesterday, and they're tripling it on Monday. And so I was able to sort of assure my anxious constituents about that all the unemployment claims are backdated, so it's not like you're going to miss out on a week. I don't know if anybody here has any questions on the pandemic unemployment program, which is actually a federal program. We have never had unemployment insurance for self-employed people in Vermont, ever. And now we have it through the CARES Act. And just transportation, I think I said last week there was a lot of money, like $20 million coming in for public transit. There's also a lot of money coming in for aviation. Burlington Airport is going to get about $8.5 million for operations because, you know, they've lost so much business. State airports are getting about $300,000. And the state airports, well, where's my notes here? And there's just additional information will be coming on that. And the DMV issues, there are a bunch of students who are taking driver's ed right now who need 6 hours of, in order to get their licenses, they need 6 hours of driving with an instructor. And I think there was going to be a meeting on Friday to see whether they would just waive that requirement. And that would greatly please my grandson, who's in that category. And let's see, trying to think of what other transportation issues. I'm just sort of running through these quickly. Mainly also waiting to see whether there's going to be another big infrastructure bill coming along as another COVID. And that's
You mean a federal infrastructure bill? Yeah.
Yeah, federal infrastructure bill, hoping for that. And then I just wanted to say one thing, the Climate Caucus met. I was not able to attend because our committee had a meeting at that moment. But I think, you know, the big issue that is sort of facing those of us in the Climate Caucus is how do we move ahead on some of the climate legislation that we passed and keep that ball rolling in the midst of this crisis. And we had a proposal in our committee about using any extra funds from the federal CARES Act to do some of our proposals like electric vehicle incentive and public transit and things like that. And there was some pushback from committee members who had all voted for this in the regular bill. So you sort of see where the fault lines are. A lot of people are saying, oh, we just need to do COVID-related legislation and we can't even think about this. And last night I came across an article, a BBC article, where it quoted Earth Day, the Secretary General of the UN, saying, we must not forget this deeper emergency in the midst of this other emergency. So I think that, you know, we need to, there is just so many similarities, and the disruption that we're experiencing now, I think, is really a disruption that potentially faces us with climate change. So I just feel like I want to try to keep moving at least in the transportation realm, to try to keep things moving a little bit on that issue. And I will stop now. Thank you.
And I'll pick that up. I'm going to speak briefly to the bill on wills, because for the notes, just to clarify that the challenge here is that that as people, as Mollie said, particularly older people who might not have paid as much attention to the need to do wills or the desire to do wills, faced with a crisis, have been wishing to do so, but the law required in-person witnessing. And so in order to protect yourself against the risk that you might get sick and have issues with probate court, you would need to put yourself at risk. You would need your will. And in order to get your will, you would need to put yourself at risk. And so that was an inherent structural problem in a pandemic environment. And so this changes the process and allows for remote signing and then other stuff, so that there is a way to address the need to have protection and through wills without putting yourself physically at risk. And I know it will make my neighbor very happy, as this is a key part of her work, and it's been a real problem. I thought I would just add on the, yes, the pandemic unemployment insurance program is now up and running, and there are capacity challenges, and there are people who have had experiences of ease and success with it, and others who, or at least getting through the application process, and others who have struggled. And so we're going to need to pay attention to that. I have to say, a week ago, the governor said all the backlog of UI will be cleared and checks will go out to the 8,000 people who haven't been cleared. My son has been laid off from a large restaurant group in the Burlington area for a month now, and has yet to receive a letter, email, be able to get through, didn't receive a check. Nothing has happened this week for him, despite the governor's claims, and I suspect that he is not like uniquely positioned to be experiencing that gap. And so there is something else that needs to happen there, and we're on the House Commerce Committee, we're starting to get feedback that things, that the reality on the ground is not quite what was announced last weekend in terms of that issue. And so we'll continue to monitor that to try to figure it out. And the bill that we passed this week around the Department of Labor getting access to tax data, just want to make clear that there's two reasons for that. One is basically just fraud protection. They're just using the data from tax to verify people's self-reporting. And they probably could have gotten away with the existing statutory authorities, but they came to the legislature because they wanted to be absolutely clear about what the parameters were around their access to private data. Typically, this is not shared directly between the Department of Labor and Tax, and so required special authorities. And so it was done in a way to be for auditing purposes, and also in the process of applying, there's a checkbox that indicates that you are giving the Department of Labor the authority to verify with the tax department. And so they're trying to limit the amount of information they need and trying to make sure that that is going to be done. And then they've asked the legislature for the specific authority that allows them to do it. So even though people have filled out the application right now, the extra level of checking isn't happening until the law changes to allow for it. So they've asked your permission, but they aren't doing it yet until that changes. So they're trying to respect that balance between privacy and the access needed to make sure that the rollout of this program is accurate and appropriate. I wanted to comment too on the floor thing. It was about 5 hours. And I will say this: it was very moving in many ways that we were able to accomplish this. And I know that probably seems a little odd, like it was moving to be a part of a Zoom meeting. But if you think about what it takes to get 150 people from all over the state, sort of in that system and functioning, it's a testament to our resiliency and the resiliency of our democracy that we were able to get there. And part of the challenge, frankly, is that we have pretty wide range of technological skillfulness within the legislature, and we have some members who have no smartphone, have no computer at home, no device at home, who are trying to learn, on the fly after many years of service in the legislature. They're trying to learn a new skill, under pressure, and that's really hard. And so it's taken us some time. There's been some messy moments. It's live streamed. All of the work that the legislature is doing in the House anyway right now, I assume in the Senate, but all the work in the House is live streamed to YouTube whenever we are meeting, both at the committee level and at the whole body level. And so people can watch in a way that's never really been possible before. And I have a feeling that we'll probably move to keep this mode going. I'm not sure how it will work when we're in the building, but I would not be surprised if this radically changes at least the House's behavior going forward, as far as making our in committee on the record work followable on YouTube Live, because it radically opens up the process to people in a way that's very healthy and good. And then the last thing I wanted to comment on is that the Vermont State College conversation had broken out into the public in a big way last weekend when we last met. And then since then, the chancellor has withdrawn his initial proposal, and there is quite a bit of activity happening between the chancellor, the trustees, and the legislature to sort of try to get a sense of what might be possible, and how to buy some time for the legislature to grapple with the long-term strategic ramifications of what the chancellor's proposal meant. And I have a lot of opinions about that, and I'm happy to talk about this if we get into it through questions. But I wanted to let everyone know I am a trustee at the University of Vermont. I've been a trustee for 5 years, elected by the legislature. The legislature has the authority to elect 9 members of the University of Vermont board, and I think 3 members of the Vermont State College board. And so we actually have a formal governance role within those 2 systems. And so I do have a perspective, and I'm naming this now because I have written a response to an op-ed that Byron Stuckey wrote this week on the State College crisis, and I haven't turned it in yet, and I'm going to reach out to Byron directly, and as part of my responsibility to our citizens to also share my thinking directly before I respond publicly. But I did want to let you all know that I am going to be sending something into the Reformer as a follow-up from my perspective as a legislator, but also as a trustee at the University of Vermont. And so if that comes up later on in the conversation, happy to do a little deeper dive there. And with that, I will step back, and this is an opportunity for you all to offer questions, insights, or sort of direct us as far as it goes, where we take the conversation. Bob, I see your hand, and why don't you start?
I'm going to try to talk without the video, and maybe I won't be too garbled. So, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So on the Vermont State College, I had heard that the governor had said something about let's do a big plan that involves all of education in Vermont. And on its face, that sounded very positive. But I understand that there might be some, I don't know, some hidden agendas in that. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that, or should I just wait to see your piece in the Reformer?
No, actually, I will definitely speak to that, and then Mollie, you can jump in after me if that's all right with you. So, thank you, Bob. That's a really good question. And when the governor says that, in the policy language of the legislature, what the governor is kind of quietly saying is we should have a K to 16 system, not a K to 12 system. So right now, we have a K to 12 system that is funded through property taxes and some portion of the sales tax. It is the education fund, the ed fund, that supports that system. And when the governor says he wants to have a whole system view, what he's effectively trying to do is take the appropriation that comes through the general fund for the Vermont State Colleges, for UVM, and for VSAC, which is the sort of the three-legged stool of our public dollars that go to Vermont higher education, and put those expenses within the ed fund. And so there's a logic to it that sounds like, oh, that sounds like a really good idea. We should have this comprehensive view. But what it's really doing, if you do that, is it's actually trying to either squeeze the local school budgets or shift the burden of that expense onto the property tax, and will raise taxes for people throughout the state depending on where they fall in the income sensitivity for property tax payments, whether they're renters or not. It's a very significant increase on the property tax unless you cut proportionally, in which case it's an attempt to shrink the size of state spending on public education, in the guise of a strategic alignment. And so we're, frankly, I mean, certainly the Democrats and the progressives in the House and Senate are starting from a position of deep skepticism around that particular move, which is not to say that there should not be a strategic thought about what those different components of that system look like, and maybe even better integration, in efforts. But on the funding side, this move of sort of quietly saying, let's just fund it through the property tax is not likely to get much support in the legislature. And Mollie, do you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good soundbite. Sounds really great. We're all behind the governor and what he's doing, so it's really important to view that with skepticism. We had, I don't know if you remember, a couple of years ago, we had a big issue with the governor, wanting to do a statewide teachers contract. Think about it. I mean, all these different, we have the different union contracts, and then we have the state college union contracts, UVM. I mean, it's sort of a pipe dream. But I agree with Tristan that a strategic look at our whole system would be a really good idea. So.
Bob, any follow-up questions or comments on that?
Well, you mentioned taxes, and we're getting a queasy feeling. This is sort of speaking from more the perspective here of someone who sits on the Board of Abatements and the Board of Assessment Appeals, as to what kind of a workload we're going to see down the line, or whether there's going to be some relief coming somehow, somewhere, or some organization that might alleviate some of that tension. Yeah,
and this is where we're having Emily now on the Ways and Means Committee is an incredible asset for our community. And I miss her voice, because the day-to-day of the tax issues is something that, in her new role on that committee, she's in the mix on every day. But fundamentally, there are, as I understand it, there are a couple of very big challenges at the municipal level. One is some municipalities have not yet collected all of the taxes that they would then send to the state to cover their share of the education fund costs. And that becomes a huge cash flow problem of how do they get those taxes out of taxpayers who might be financially challenged by COVID. And what do they do if they come up short? And if people can't afford to pay, which I think is implied in your question about because of your role on the tax abatement and everything, this is likely to be a place where you personally will see, and that committee will see people who are financially challenged in this environment. And so it creates quite a bit of pressure there. And then just sort of in parallel on the municipal side, if municipalities aren't able to raise funds that typically have been raised, what do they do? And at the federal level, this issue is, I guess, both identified as a key phase of the federal response in creating funding for states and municipalities, counties that are experiencing this dynamic. And it is also a political hot potato. It was the major obstacle in the last round of negotiations, and then they punted on it. And then you may have seen that the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, came out and said basically, no, states and everyone can go bankrupt, that's fine. It'll be interesting to see how long he's able to hold that position and how much influence he has on this issue. Of course, he has substantial power, but he doesn't have to lose very many of his Republicans before he actually is going to lose that vote. And if this pressure is experienced at all systemically, as it certainly looks like it will be across other states, there's going to be tremendous pressure from within his own caucus for them to come up with something. So we're at a wait and see moment. And unfortunately, I think that means for some municipalities, they may need to engage in short-term borrowing or other strategies to maintain their cash flow and their cash position in the face of very complicated tax. What's the right word here? But the receipt of local tax payments, and of course, sales tax has dried up substantially, which is another, for the 1% towns like Brattleboro, is another source of funding. So there's a lot of layers to this problem, and Ways and Means in the House and Finance in the Senate. Becca Ballant, our senator from Brattleboro, but one of our 2 Windham County senators, is on the Finance Committee. So we have good people paying attention and trying to work through. And frankly, I don't think that the legislature has formed an opinion yet of what the answer is on the parts that are really the legislature's to own. They're still working through that. There's a lot of unintended consequences that go along with each of the different paths that they could take.
Oh, and I would just add that, I was in the legislature during Tropical Storm Irene, and there was a lot of, the federal money, FEMA money, there was all these different funds that were coming in and getting mixed up. And if we were to get federal money, then, we could really benefit from this. But I think the political situation in Washington saying, well, states can just declare bankruptcy, at this point, it doesn't look good. But I think what Tristan said about, there's going to be a lot of pressure from Republicans for that as well.
Thank you. It's very helpful. It is what it is.
Anybody else want to throw a topic out for us?
Okay. Michael Bosworth. I'd like to go back to the state college thing. I didn't expect the proposal would fly because there'd be so much political pushback for Northeast Kingdom, Randolph, et cetera. at least to do it right away. But what can we think of any good solution if the system's losing that much money as far as keeping those campuses open?
So I'll dive in here, and Mollie can follow me or not. Here's my concern, Michael. I think it's absolutely clear that these institutions are hugely valuable to the regions that they're in. The communities really have grown up in a way that's sort of interdependent. The colleges provide a lot of stable jobs, local business activity and culture, and the towns have grown to meet that. In its own small way, I grew up in Marlboro. My dad has been a faculty member at Marlboro College for 48 years. And I've been working at Marlboro part-time for 7 years. And, I have a very insider experience of what it's like to face that loss, because my job will disappear very shortly, and Marlboro's soon to be an empty campus looking for an owner, or looking for a plan in a very similar way to what the state colleges are facing. The larger problem, though, and this was certainly true for Marlboro, from my perspective, based on what I've seen of the finances, the larger problem is a macro problem of demographics in the Northeast and of shifts in the landscape, the business landscape of higher education, and the acute demographics of Vermont. And this will be these are things that I've put into my my response that I'm going to send into the reformer. But just to contextualize what I mean by that in some ways the political power that has protected the state colleges over the last few years, without also then making the kind of scale of investment that would be necessary to keep them going, has hidden from us the true nature of the demographic problem. And there are, I pulled data from the Agency of Education that between 2004 and 2018, which is the last time the data set was updated, there are the number of high school seniors graduating in Vermont went from 6,679 down to 5,199. So a drop of more than 20% in less than a generation. And the state colleges primarily appeal to Vermonters. So the majority of their students come from within the state system. And frankly, we as a state only do just slightly better than 50% of our high school seniors graduating going on to any kind of college experience, which trails the national average. We're very good at graduating them from high school. We're in the top 10 in graduating from high school, and we are not anywhere near as successful at 2 or 4 year college attainment. And so what that means is that there are just simply not that many bodies for the state colleges to get into their system. And the merger of Johnson and Linden into Northern Vermont University was an attempt to create a brand that would appeal to out-of-staters. And while that was a legitimate strategic choice, the reality is that throughout the Northeast, we've had a demographic decline of seniors. So the problem that Vermont is experiencing is happening throughout the Northeast, that more than half of college students still go to school within 100 miles of their home. And so for the state colleges to compete for students, they were mostly going to be competing within the Northeast. And the Northeast has a higher concentration of institutions competing for those same students. There are fewer students. And what that means is that if you are successful getting them, you're usually having to do so by competing on the cost of education. You're giving them larger and larger grants to get them to accept an offer. And so that it's a race to the bottom where you're bringing students in, but you're not getting enough revenue from each student to provide financial security. And so this is the question, is like these institutions were built and sort of scaled for a different era of our population. And so the built environment basically is bigger, the capacity is bigger than what we need demographically. And it's very, very expensive and very, very difficult to compete for the students who would fill those empty spaces. And so we're in a real trap there. And demographically, the chancellor's right, probably, that a distributed campus for Vermont Tech and Castleton as the flagship of the state college system for in-person, residential-based liberal arts education, 2 and 4 year, and CCV with its distributed campuses probably demographically matched to what our actual capacity is. But from the institutional and community and economic cost of what that means, that creates huge unanswered questions about, well, how those communities can thrive going forward without those institutions there. So I don't know if I've answered the question at all, but this is the dynamic. It's complex.
Well, you sort of answered it, and it doesn't seem to be any good answers.
There certainly are no easy answers,
Yeah.
and I'm not sure if there are any good answers. Mollie.
I just wanted to say that the majority leader has put out a survey to people to sort of poll their constituents on any ideas that they may have. So they're really like searching out, reaching out to people about, thoughts and ideas. I think this crisis has sort of pulled into focus the idea of online learning. And, there are certainly pros and cons to that. I mean, as Tristan was referencing in our Zoom all house session the other day, it's complex and hard. And I think it's been hard for a lot of college students, your student, I'm sure, Tristan, to not be with friends and to be sort of cooped up in a room with a computer learning that way. But for some people that does work, and those kinds of opportunities, obviously, with expanded broadband. I mean, that's the other issue, is that if we had better broadband in Vermont, it might attract more remote workers as well, to sort of bring people into those communities. So, and we don't know. I mean, in the aftermath of this crisis, whether more people are going to want to move to a place like Vermont to be sort of out of a densely populated place that we've had great success with our numbers in terms of the COVID crisis. A lot of it, I mean, certainly good leadership, but also I think our dispersed population has really contributed to that. So, I think there are just so many unknowns, but I think that there will be a really good concerted effort to try to solve this problem.
Yeah, and I may be going too deep, and I apologize if I am, but I wanted to speak to the online education piece for a moment, and so tangentially, I do think the COVID crisis has made it even more politically realistic that we're going to do a deep investment in changing Vermont's broadband access. It's been a decade plus that we've done incrementalism, and I'm hoping that this crisis allows us to see just how badly inequitable that sentence got lost. But anyway, how completely problematic the inequitable access to broadband is for the future of Vermont and for rural communities. So hugely important. One of the things that often comes up with respect to the state colleges is, well, can you do online learning? And then you get, you're competing in a larger marketplace than just Vermont. And the simple truth of that is that for most institutions who don't yet have a strong online market that they're already in, getting into one is very, very expensive. And because they're now competing with global players. And like Southern New Hampshire University is in our region has really invested 10 years in becoming a pioneer in this area of education. They have 24-hour call centers to support students. They have incredibly elaborate systems to compete on a global marketplace. Purdue University bought Kaplan, I think it was, and launched Purdue Global. These are gigantic investments, and to carve out even a niche in that market is very expensive. And the data that I've seen from professional consultants around higher education have said that if you're not already in that marketplace and competing well, online education is a modality that your students expect and need for their flexibility, but as a financial model or a revenue generator, it is no longer competitive if you aren't already in the game at a pretty deep level. So you have to do it because your young students expect the flexibility and need it, but you can't count on it making you profit that you can then use to offset the cost of finding and bringing students into the institution. And so I know that this is going to come up from legislators and from constituents that say, well, can't the state colleges do this? And the answer is yes, they can do more of it. And it's very, very unlikely that will generate net profit that will subsidize the operations of the institutions because of the competitiveness of this part of the higher education market. So sorry, that's another way of saying, Michael, it's very complicated and there are no good answers. Millicent, yeah.
Hi, you mentioned that there's a recognition, or you feel strongly that that broadband gets fixed around the state. What are the actual conversations happen? What's actually happening? Yeah. What's the actual commitment, or what's the status of those conversations on the floor or in committees?
Yeah. So thank you. It's a very good question. Right now, it's still in the thinking through, like, how do we take this moment and do something bigger? But one of the ways in which I think the landscape has changed is that the governor has been really difficult on this issue. He said, we of course need to meet these goals, but anytime we tried to create funding that would do anything substantial, he basically has squashed it. I don't think that he can politically afford to squash it now. And so to me, that opens up an opportunity for us to think bigger about what we want to do. I think if he's running for re-election coming out of this crisis and isn't thinking about, isn't supporting a major investment here, that Vermonters will see that as a failure to meet the moment, that it is very clear from equitable access for kids who need online learning in this time of distributed public education to parents who need to be able to work, that this is the oxygen, the lifeblood of the modern economy. And if we choose to not invest now to get ourselves back up to a reasonable standard throughout the whole state, that we're choosing to be irrelevant economically for a generation. And I certainly think that will come as a centerpiece of the political campaign for governor if he stands in our way. And so the question then is, what can we come up with that strategically? And right now I know that the chair and vice chair of the House Technology Committee, Energy and Technology Committee, are engaged in trying to think that through. And hopefully you'll see, if not from both bodies, at least from the House, a pretty bold proposal come out of our work this summer. Yeah, Ronald.
Unmuted. Good. Hi. Um, in relation to talking about this broadband stuff, and I'll keep my personal stuff as close as I can on this because I'm not in favor in certain ways. But I was when I got to listen to Emily and Olga's interview with the state auditor on their podcast, I found his comments really interesting about how the state had made a big mistake by not taking care of this before and just licensing this out to, I guess, Xfinity or Comcast or whoever to build the lines for broadband everywhere. So it became a business thing that we were contributing to. Could you speak more to that? Like, is that something,
Sure.
is there something in there we can follow up on, that this thing you're talking about, how to establish this, bringing everybody into the internet world, something to bring up for the governor, whatever? Could we follow up on how we made this error? Because it did seem pretty glaring that we gave up this ability to have universal broadband at that time. And now it's up to somebody else to grant us that we are going to be the people who, the businesses who make money off of this, including the college businesses. Thanks.
Yeah, so also, I think it's actually very similar to the conversation or the political debate at the federal level that led to Obamacare versus the single payer option, in that we, like most of the country, frankly, if not all of the country, we chose to try to build off of the for-profit business infrastructure. You know, those for-profit businesses had moved in and created competitive products in the population centers, but not in places where the return on investment wasn't very good. And so, you know, this, which is very similar to health insurance companies that took the healthy and did everything that they could do on the prior to Obamacare to exclude people who were sick and needy. You know, they took the profitable customers and left everybody else. And effectively what we did is we said, okay, well, they've taken the profitable customers. What would it take for us to subsidize, call it the last mile, but, you know, what would it take for us to subsidize or support the infrastructure build out for everybody else? And can we do that and do that incrementally and over time? And we haven't done it very well. You know, so we, at one point 6-7 years ago, we were resting on our laurels and saying, look, according to the statistics, we have one of the top 5 level systems in the country, and we just have a few places that need to be figured out. And then the rest of the country had done so much more investment than we did that the FCC redefined what was considered high-speed access, and then all of a sudden we were one of the worst in the country. Nothing had changed in our system. It was that the rest of the country lapped us, and suddenly we were substantially trailing. And the flip side is that, you know, if and this is true in this country in general, right? We do not treat broadband as a public utility, and this is the fundamental challenge. And it's like healthcare. If we treat healthcare as a fundamental right and then, you know, sort of work that way, versus healthcare is something that we want to prop up but we don't consider to be a right of everybody to have, you know, then we choose to build out healthcare where business has chosen not to be. Very similar pattern of behavior, and fundamentally it's a political problem. And there are some real problems with the for-profit businesses and the way that they've built out, including, you know, how those businesses have been able to access the federal funds that were designed to stimulate deep access into rural areas, and how they, you know, met compliance for receiving the money, but not necessarily the performance that was expected to come with it. And so we have really significant structural problems because of our commitment to build off of that for-profit business landscape and try to fill in the gaps, as opposed to treating it as a public utility from the very beginning. And I think that that's probably what Doug was was referencing. Whether we can now, this is, I guess, my point too, is that the crisis of the pandemic and the inequities that are showing up and what that means may allow us a political moment to reframe around broadband access as a public utility.
And this goes back to Shumlin too. I mean, when Shumlin was governor, oh, we're going to do everything to the last mile, and we're going to do it in 2 years. You know,
it's funny. You know, I was at one of the SEDS meetings in Bellows Falls. The very sparsely attended meetings that SEDS had hosted, and somebody who had been involved with the start of SovereignEd at that meeting said, like, wow, this going to the last mile thing is really like just never going to work. It's such a horrible business model that it's never going to, you know, and this is somebody who had been there from before the beginning of the internet. And that's sort of where I had been at too. I was like, well, why would you invest? You know, this is not the phone. This is not electricity. This is not the phone lines. This is the internet. This is a business model put in the hands of business folks who actually are supporting the political agenda as well to make some of this stuff work. And so what I was going to say is, if there was a chance to regain that as a utility, a publicly held utility, well, since you're making this analogy with how the healthcare thing happened, would that maybe then catalyze us to move towards healthcare as a social, you know, cause? Because we did it with broadband. I mean, I'm just saying, if we're going to go with that analogy, there's a way of thinking that way. I mean, I think the political will is very different, so there's some changes to make, right? So
certainly exposes the cracks in the healthcare system, this issue.
So
and there's and one of the concepts you'll hear talked about in the broadband side is fiber to the premise. FTTP or something is the acronym. And you know, right now what we have is DSL lines, we have fiber in some places, we have cable, we have all these different technologies. The reason why fiber to the premise is such a compelling potential investment is that it is much more future proof. It's also wired, not using wireless technology, so it's not broadcast over the through towers. It's directly to the home, but it's also scalable. And so there's a lot of interesting stuff here. Stay tuned. I think we'll probably continue to talk about it over the next couple of months as we see where things go. And actually, you know, the pivot to healthcare, I wanted to comment on that for a second. You know, Mollie was there when the legislature passed an intent to move us towards a single payer system, and then that process, as many of you know, fell apart with, you know, under the Shumlin administration's study of it, and the legislature in many ways has stayed away from it with Phil Scott as governor and everything. We really haven't returned to ask that fundamental question. Has the landscape of healthcare changed enough that we should be revisiting this question? And what did we learn in the last attempt? And is it time to be trying to get ready for another attempt or some sort of collaborative regional attempt or something else like it? And I personally would like to see that become a more prominent political question for us. And I think Vermonters would generally be very, very supportive of us trying this again. Doesn't mean we will succeed in finding the right business model for a a single payer system, even if business model within the government. But at the very least, I think we owe it to Vermonters to try, because the healthcare problems have not gone away.
And I'm sorry that Ellen Schwartz isn't here, because she has really kept she and a bunch of other people have really kept the flame alive for that. So.
Yeah. Yes, go Oscar. Sorry, I was getting notifications on my phone, trying to clear them.
Oh, it's okay. I don't know, this may be sort of an ignorant question, but I've been wondering what kind of high level strategy is happening at the state level about, trying to proactively design sort of future economy? Because when you think about demographic trends and towns relying on institutions that may not be as viable as they were, or ski industry tourism that may be threatened by climate change, or even like all the small retail in Brattleboro that's already threatened by online shopping, like that problem's clearly not going away. So yeah, is there a high level strategy going on around that? And if so, what could you tell me?
Tristan's on the Commerce Committee, so I think
Okay.
it's better.
Yeah, well, so what I can tell you is that I am a part of an informal group that is very interested in this question right now, and in almost exactly the same frame that you just offered. The way I see it, and I should say, I'm a bit of a sort of complex systems geek. That's part of what I've done at Marlborough College, is teach classes around complex systems. And what that tells me is that in a time of disruption is also the time of the greatest sort of creative potential of a system to change. And we have been experiencing a slow erosion of rural economy, of the rural economy. Rural communities have been losing the anchor businesses in their little small downtowns. They might have only a general store and a convenience store or something like that, or a gas station. Like they may have only a limited number of things that form the backbone of a rural community's business community, but also its cultural, social meeting points. And we've been losing them in lots of towns throughout the state. And Brattleboro's downtown, of course, has been very, very vulnerable, and also at the same time remarkably resilient. And so what is the opportunity now to think about future resilience in our economy, of what we can do to stimulate more thriving in rural communities? Broadband internet access is clearly a threshold problem. Like without it, there's almost certainly no way forward for a lot of rural Vermont to have access to the modern economy. But what that means is still up in the air. So it hasn't yet broken out into a clear set of recommendations on the policy level, but there are people for sure organizing around it. And I'm also aware of the fact that the Vermont Council on Rural Development is contemplating what role it can play in a statewide conversation around these kind of core questions. And you could frame it as basically as fundamental as what is the future of Vermont, or what would it take us now to investing in or choosing that would allow for a thriving, resilient future Vermont. Those are questions that they are very good at, the kind of hosting in communities, and so I'm hoping that they are able to make that commitment. I think it's still in the planning phases as to whether or not they can do it. But there are some really good people out there who are definitely grappling with this. And sort of personally, I'm interested in bringing the regenerative frame to it. So what is it? Resilient and regenerative frame, because we can't just replicate what we had before and expect that we'll be resilient in the face of future crisis. We need to reimagine. Millicent.
To that point, I just wanted to find out if you are aware of some of the work that Maine is doing, the state of Maine or that region is doing. There's a website, and I can't remember it now. If you may be already aware of it, but it shows some signs of some pretty good strategic thinking for the region.
Sure. I'm not aware of it, so I will check it out. Thank you.
I'll send it.
Yeah, that'd be great. And Oscar, did you have a comment? It looked like you were going to also say something.
No, is there some specific group or committee or thing I should be following if I want to sort of be aware of this?
So there is not yet that I'm aware of a specific public group that you should be following. But what, if you're able to keep checking in with me as we get our behind the scenes thinking more organized, I will let you know. I guess if you were to follow anything, it would be to watch the Vermont Council on Rural Development. I think that they're in the best position at the statewide organizational level to be doing this. But that may still be a board conversation, not a public commitment yet. But they are really dynamic thinkers around this kind of work, and are going to be a key asset if we are able to do anything.
Okay, I guess so it sounds like that this kind of sort of economic strategic planning it's something that might happen in times where it seems like times of opportunity or challenge. There isn't like a standing process at the state level there isn't a plan that's constantly being revised or a task force that's
there is
okay.
Yeah, so there are several different levels to that. So the governor every 5 years basically has to update this. We do a statewide SEDS, Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy, that was recently updated and is pretty good. We do also have to do a statewide workforce development strategy. The House Commerce and Economic Development Committee is one policy tool, developer, as is the Senate Economic Development Committee. So there are formal processes, and it's worth getting yourself familiar with those. But what I will say, is that they're working with all of those processes work sort of within the traditional paradigms of how this works. And I thought, and maybe I'm wrong, but I think that your question sort of went to, is there some outside of the box, outside of the traditional paradigm level thinking that's happening given the disruption of this moment? And there is, but that's less formal right now. But there is definitely the formal process that's worth paying attention to as well.
Okay, thank you.
Tristan?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So I just wanted to add to that conversation that there are sort of two places that really offer a lot of opportunity to be incorporated into this conversation. And one is the transportation realm, and in terms of making downtowns more pedestrian and bicycle friendly, are sort of strategies to help with economic development and land use planning and a lot of things like that, and making eventually public transit more accessible and fare free. And the other is the role of the creative economy, which often gets sort of shunted to the side, but that there's a huge number of jobs in Vermont that are attributed to the creative economy. And how do we invest more in that and think more in that and align that, it's not like a separate thing from business, but to sort of integrate business thinking in the creative economy. So I just wanted to put those two things into the conversation.
When you say creative economy, like an arts community, that sort of thing?
Well, a broader, there's a strategic effort by the Arts Council, the Vermont Creative Economy, and they have different people in different regions that are working on, arts businesses, arts initiatives, detailing the economic impact of the arts sector in Vermont. And it's huge, it's really big. And it often gets left out of the conversation, but you can just look on Vermont Arts Council Creative Economy to just sort of get a sense of the strategic plan that's happening there. And Sarah Coffey is going to be hosting a creative economy town hall meeting, I forget, sometime in May. So there'll be information about that coming out.
Okay, thanks, Mollie.
And I'll just add one more layer because I think it actually makes sense both to add right now, and also I think it's an area I'd love to have us return to as a ensemble in the weeks ahead. Vermont's demographic challenge, and Windham County is among the most challenged in the state around an aging population and the number of people who are wanting to participate in the workforce and all of that. We have a part of our thinking or part of our population that says, you know, Vermont should not grow. We need to get out of a growth mindset. We can be stable where we are. And there, I understand some of the thinking around that, you know, on sort of the theoretical level, but but there is a pretty significant challenge right now in Vermont that without a major shift in our demographics in places outside of the Burlington area, there just simply aren't enough people participating in the economy to create the next wave of resilient businesses. And the last time that Vermont was in a similar situation to the moment it's in now, the wave of young people, young, creative, inspired, back to the land crowd transformed Vermont in the 60s and 70s, and in a huge way. I mean, it was a big influx of population from other, you know, more populous areas with a lot of creative energy and excitement and commitment. And the Vermont that we know now was in large part a fusion of that pre 60s 70s wave and the impact of the 60s and 70s wave on Vermont culture, on farming, on the arts, and politics. And, you know, I think we forget, for instance, that Bill Clinton was the first Democratic presidential candidate to win Vermont. That before that, we were always a state that went Republican. And, you know, that the shift that happened over the last 30 years as that the children and grandchildren of that wave of in-migration transformed the state, that what we have now is a function of that burst of creative energy and in-migration. And it strikes me that one possible consequence of the pandemic is that we have a new burst of in-migration of creative younger people. You know, the millennials have a much stronger kind of commitment to quality of life and values driven lifestyle. And if we, you know, if that happens, that may be a part of our regenerative process, I guess I'll say. I saw Mary nodding. Do you have anything you want to add as a comment, or you just, no? Okay. Mollie, did you want to comment
Well,
at
I was
all?
just going to say, as an original Black to the Lander, I concur.
I thought, I didn't want to, you know,
Call me out.
Yeah, I didn't want to call you out. I figured you'd self-identify, but you know, that absolutely, like, there was.
No, it's very exciting times. And there was a, you know, I think the real recognition of the importance of the culture that existed here already, and how to not turn it over, but how to assimilate within it rather than replace it. So
Yeah, I'm just going to read two things in the chat from Jerry. Not a quote: "In Vermont, nonprofit arts and culture make up a larger than $123 million industry, supporting thousands of jobs and millions of dollars in revenue to local and state governments." And the 4,268 full-time equivalent jobs, 2.6 million in revenue to local government, and 7.2 million to state government. And so, just to put some numbers behind Mollie's framing around the creative economy and the impact that it has on the state, and it is, you know, our area in particular, Brattleboro area, is particularly sort of rich in those resources, and it's something that when I talk to people who live elsewhere about all the stuff that goes on here, they're like, how big is this area? I'm like, well, our town's about 12,000, and about 25 in the surrounding towns, and they're like, how on earth does that happen? And it's a part of our strength for sure, and our uniqueness, and something hopefully we can build on. We've reached a little over an hour here. Is there any new burning issue that would like to be brought into the conversation? All right. Well, then I think I will bring this to a close, and I so appreciate your participation. And next week, I'm sure we'll have Emily back, and maybe we'll get our senator back as well. And do reach out this week if there's anything in between that we can help address. And thank you so much.